The ventilator alarm screams. Leo Vance's pupil just twitched. The system says he's brain dead, but I saw it. A flicker of life. The transplant team is already prepping the harvest, and my chief of medicine just ordered security to stop me. I've got one shot. Grab the diagnostic drive before they shut me down. Because if I don't, they'll carve up a living man for a senator's new heart. And I'll be next. The guard's fist slams into the door frame as I duck under the gurney. The drive's in my pocket, but the data's worse than I thought. This isn't a glitch. It's a kill switch. And they're coming. The sterile scent of ozone and floor wax clung to David Miller's scrubs as he gripped the metal railing of bed 4. On the monitor, the patient's heart rate stuttered in rhythmic, jagged peaks. Leo Vance, just 22 years old, lay beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, his face partially obscured by the plastic cage of a ventilator mask. To the hospital's automated systems, he was already a ghost, a collection of viable organs waiting for a harvest. But David saw something else. He leaned in closer, his eyes fixed on the boy's right eye. There, in the center of the iris, was a microscopic twitch, a flicker of life that the high-tech sensors, calibrated for efficiency rather than hope, had completely ignored. David's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He knew the protocol. The death certificate had been digitally signed, the harvest teams were already scrubbing in, and the private jets were fueling up. But that twitch was a signal, a flare sent from a drowning mind. David reached into his pocket and felt the smooth, cool surface of his riverstone. He tapped it exactly 5 times against his wedding ring. Click, 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 click. The tactile thump grounding him as the ICU's ambient hum threatened to swallow his resolve. Subverted. Phase 1. Build hope. David knew he had to act fast. He wasn't just a doctor. He was the last line of defense between Leo and the scalpel. He moved with the practiced grace of a man who had spent 18-hour shifts in this very room, knowing every dial and every hidden override. He decided to manually stall the ventilator. It was a smart, calculated move. By adjusting the oxygen flow just enough to trigger a manual review status without causing a full system crash, he could force the harvest team to wait. He had done this once before during a power surge, and it had bought the patient an extra hour of life. He looked at the screen, his mind racing through the logic. If he could prove the brain activity was still there, the harvest would be legally halted. The system was designed to protect life, and he was simply using its own safety nets to ensure no mistake was made. He felt a surge of professional confidence. He was the expert here, the one who saw what the machines missed. Phase 2. False positive. He turned the plastic dial. The mechanical hiss of the ventilator changed pitch, softening into a more natural rhythmic sigh. On the main console, the red Harvest Ready light flickered and turned a steady, cautious amber. It was working. The automated countdown on the wall froze at 4 minutes. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His shoulders dropped an inch, and the tension in his jaw began to bleed away. He had stalled the machine. The harvest team, seen through the glass of the scrub room, paused their movements, looking at their own tablets in confusion. David wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. He had bought Leo time. He had outsmarted the cold, digital bureaucracy of St. Jude's. Phase 3. The crack, but as he stepped back to check Leo's pupils again, he noticed a small, blinking icon in the corner of the primary monitor. It wasn't a medical alert. It was a tiny, stylized gavel. He frowned, leaning in. The icon was pulsing in time with Leo's heart, but it was blue, not red. David's skin prickled. Why was the legal department's software active on an ICU bedside terminal? He heard the heavy, definitive thud of the magnetic locks engaging on the ICU doors. That wasn't part of the manual review protocol. Phase 4. Catastrophic reveal. The screen suddenly turned a blinding, solid white before text began to scroll in black. Block letters. Unauthorized clinical interference detected. Emergency legal protectorate activated. David lunged for the dial, trying to turn the oxygen back up. But the knob spun freely in his hand, disconnected from the internal gears. He hadn't stalled the process. He had triggered a tamper-proof lockout. By manually touching the controls after a death certificate had been issued, David had moved the situation from a medical dispute to a criminal one. The system hadn't just ignored his input. It had used his interference as a legal trigger to revoke his credentials and hand over total control to the hospital's AI-driven legal defense suite. A notification popped up. Dr. David Miller. Access denied. Malpractice protocol initiated. Police notified. David realized with a sickening lurch in his stomach that he had walked right into a trap. Dr. Sterling didn't want a quiet harvest. He wanted a harvest that was legally bulletproof. By trying to save Leo, David had provided the criminal act necessary for the hospital to claim that any further brain activity was the result of David's unauthorized tampering rather than the patient's own recovery. He had just handed Sterling the keys to Leo's execution and his own professional suicide. The world tilted as the sound of heavy boots echoed in the hallway. The heavy doors to the ICU didn't just open. They hissed with a predatory intent. Mike Sullivan, the head of security, filled the frame. He was a mountain of a man, his neck thicker than David's thigh, his knuckles scarred from years of managing the city's more difficult arrivals. He adjusted his heavy duty belt. Clank, clink, the sound of leather groaning under the weight of handcuffs and a baton. "Step away from the unit, Miller," Sullivan growled. His voice was like gravel being crushed in a tin can. He didn't look at Leo. He didn't look at the monitors. He looked only at David, his eyes fixed with the unwavering focus of a man who viewed orders as the only holy text worth reading. "He's alive, Mike," David said, his voice cracking. He held his ground between the gurney and the giant. "Look at the pupil response. I'm telling you, the sensors are miscalibrated." Sullivan didn't blink. "Orders are orders, Doc. And my orders say you're a trespasser in your own ward." He lunged forward. The scuffle was short and violent. David was lean and fast, fueled by a desperate adrenaline, but Sullivan was a wall of muscle. David ducked a heavy, swinging fist that whistled past his ear, the air pressure of the blow stinging his cheek. He slid under a rolling gurney, the metal wheels shrieking against the linoleum. As he scrambled on the floor, his hand brushed against the pocket of Leo's discarded jeans draped over a chair nearby. He felt a hard, rectangular shape, the diagnostic thumb drive, the raw, unedited data from the crash site. He snatched it just as Sullivan's hand clamped onto his shoulder like a vice. The guard's grip was bone-crushing. David twisted, his scrubs tearing with a sharp rip, and he shoved a heavy tray of stainless steel instruments toward the floor. The crash was deafening. Scalpels, clamps, and kidney basins hit the floor in a cacophony of ringing metal. In the doorway, Nurse Jennifer Foster stood frozen for a heartbeat before she saw David's eyes. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She tripped into the path of the second security guard entering the room, sending a stack of sterile linens flying like a white cloud of confetti. "Go!" she hissed, her voice a sharp, urgent hum. David didn't look back. He bolted for the service exit, his sneakers squeaking on the floor. He burst into the stairwell, the door slamming shut behind him with a metallic boom that vibrated through the concrete. The air in the stairwell was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and cold dust. He leaned against the wall, gasping for air, his hand trembling as he clutched the thumb drive. He needed a computer. He needed to see what was on this drive before Sterling's Code Red team found him. He began to climb, his heart a frantic bird trapped in his chest. Every floor he passed felt like a year added to his life. He reached the third-floor landing and ducked into a small, auxiliary lab used for nighttime blood work. It was dark, the only light coming from the glowing green on buttons of the centrifuges. He jammed the drive into a terminal. His fingers flew across the keys, bypassing the login screens with a series of emergency overrides he'd learned during the last system upgrade. The data began to scroll. It wasn't just a glitch. It was a masterpiece of digital deception. The software hadn't been miscalibrated. It had been surgically altered. Someone had written a sequence of instructions, a digital mask, that sat on top of the brainwave data. Whenever the sensors detected a spike in activity, the mask would filter it out, replacing the noise of a living brain with the flat, steady hum of a dead one. David's breath hitched. He scrolled further, looking for the authorization trail. The digital signature wasn't a name, but a code. RS-99-WING. Robert Sterling, 1999. The year Sterling had taken over the board. And then he saw the recipient list. The heart wasn't going to a local father of 3 or a teacher on the wait list. It was earmarked for Senator Harrison, the man currently holding the pen on a $50 million federal grant for the hospital's new Sterling Research Center. The Rule of 5, the 5 lives saved by one donor's harvest, wasn't a medical miracle here. It was a currency. David felt a cold, oily dread wash over him. This wasn't a mistake. It was a trade. A boy's life for a building's foundation. The overhead speakers crackled to life, the sound of a throat clearing echoing through the lab. It was Sterling's voice, smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth. Attention all staff. We have a code red. Dr. David Miller has suffered a severe psychological break. He is currently armed and has taken sensitive medical data. For his safety and the safety of our patients, he must be detained immediately. Do not approach him. Notify security of his location. David stared at the speaker. The lie was so perfect, so elegant. In one sentence, Sterling had turned the witness into the criminal. The lab door rattled. David yanked the drive from the computer and looked around. The room was a dead end. But in the corner, a small square opening led to the laundry chute. It smelled of damp, sour linens and industrial bleach. He didn't have a choice. He scrambled into the dark metal tunnel just as the lab door burst open. He slid into the void, the cold steel burning his skin as he accelerated into the darkness of the hospital's belly. He landed in a mountain of discarded sheets, the impact muffled by the weight of 1,000 hospital gowns. The basement was a labyrinth of steam pipes and humming generators. It was the graveyard of the building, where the things the hospital wanted to forget were sent to rot. David climbed out of the pile, his scrubs covered in gray lint and the faint copper smell of old blood. He moved toward the back of the room, near the heavy iron doors of the old furnace. There, tucked behind a stack of broken wheelchairs, he found a rolling filing cabinet. It was an anomaly in this high-tech fortress, an old, olive-drab steel box secured with a heavy, rusted bicycle chain. David grabbed a nearby pipe and wrenched the chain. The metal groaned and snapped. He pulled the drawer open. Inside were paper files, real, physical evidence that couldn't be deleted with a keystroke. He flipped through them, his eyes widening. He found a folder labeled Garcia. Maria Garcia was a 7-year-old girl in the pediatric ICU. She needed a liver. According to the official list, she was 42nd. But here, in Sterling's private ledger, she had been moved to the top. David realized the brilliance of the move. By saving a child alongside the senator, Sterling created a moral shield. If anyone questioned the senator's priority, Sterling could point to the little girl and say, "We saved a child today. Would you begrudge her a miracle?" It was a public relations masterpiece, built on the bones of a boy who was still trying to say sorry in his sleep. David tucked the file under his arm. He had the digital proof of the murder and the physical proof of the motive. But as he turned to find an exit, the basement lights flickered and died. In the sudden, oppressive silence, David heard the rhythmic clank-clink of a security belt. "I know you're down here, David," a voice called out. It wasn't Sullivan. It was Sarah Johnson, the hospital's legal counsel. Her voice was like cracking ice. "You're making this very difficult for the board. And the board doesn't like difficulty." David backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could hear her footsteps, sharp, precise clicks of high heels on the concrete. "You're a doctor, David," she continued, her voice moving closer. "You understand the concept of triage. One life for the many. The senator funds the wing. The wing saves thousands. Leo Vance is just a single brick. Why are you so intent on bringing down the whole building?" David reached into his pocket and squeezed the riverstone. Click, 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 click. "Because the building is crooked, Sarah," he whispered to the darkness. He lunged toward the service stairs, but a flashlight beam cut through the dark, pinning him like a moth to a wall. Standing there was the janitor he had seen earlier in the hallway, the man with the cold eyes and the tactical posture. He wasn't holding a mop. He was holding a heavy oxygen tank, his muscles coiled to strike. The man swung the tank with a grunt of effort. David dived to the left, the heavy metal cylinder smashing into a stack of glass vials. The sound of shattering glass was like a gunshot. David scrambled to his feet, grabbing the only weapon he could find, a massive, leather-bound volume of the International Classification of Diseases from a nearby desk. The assassin lunged again. David swung the book with both hands, the heavy spine connecting with the man's temple. The assassin stumbled, his flashlight spinning across the floor. David didn't wait to see if he got up. He sprinted for the stairs, his lungs burning with the scent of steam and panic. He emerged onto the main floor, but the hospital had transformed. It was no longer a place of healing, it was a cage. Armed private security guards, men in black tactical vests that didn't belong in a hospital, stood at every intersection. He was cornered. He could see the ICU entrance ahead, but it was blocked by a line of men. He ducked into a side hallway, his mind racing. He needed a way to prove Leo was alive. The data wasn't enough. He needed a physical sign that even a layman couldn't ignore. "David!" He spun around, his hand raised to strike, but it was Jennifer. She looked haggard, her glasses sliding down her nose. She shoved a small plastic case into his hands. "The chemical stimulus kit," she whispered. "It's a neurological trigger. If he's alive, his brain will react. It'll show up on the monitors as a massive spike. Not even Sterling's mask can filter out a reaction that big." "Where is he?" David asked. "They're moving him to OR 3. Thorne is scrubbing in. David, they have a shoot-to-kill order. Sterling told them you're a domestic threat." David looked at the kit. This was it. One chance to wake the boy up before they opened him up. "Get to the observation deck." David said. If I can get the stimulus in, you have to record the monitor. Don't let them turn it off. He took a shortcut through the sterile supply room, a labyrinth of cardboard boxes and plastic-wrapped gowns. The air was cold and smelled of dry paper. He was halfway through when a shadow fell across the floor. Robert Sterling stood at the far end of the aisle. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His white shirt was crisp, his silver hair perfect. But in his hand, he held a surgical scalpel. His hand was shaking, just a fraction. "You've always been a sentimentalist, David," Sterling said, his voice low and dangerous. "It's your greatest flaw. You think one life matters more than the architecture of progress." "I think a murder is a murder, Robert," David replied, his voice steady. Sterling lunged. He wasn't a fighter, but he was desperate. The scalpel slashed through the air, catching David's sleeve and drawing a thin line of red across his forearm. David caught Sterling's wrist, the two men crashing into a shelf of gauze boxes. They hit the floor in a tangle of limbs and white cardboard. Sterling was surprisingly strong, fueled by the terror of a man who saw his legacy crumbling. He pressed the scalpel toward David's throat, the cold steel biting into the skin. "I built this," Sterling hissed. "I scrubbed the filth out of this city. I won't let a nobody like Leo Vance tear it down." David twisted, using his weight to pin Sterling's arm against the floor. He punched the older man once, a sharp, clinical strike to the solar plexus. Sterling gasped, the air leaving his lungs in a wet wheeze. David wrenched the scalpel away and pinned Sterling to the ground, his knee on the man's chest. "It's over, Robert," David panted. The door to the supply room burst open. Sarah Johnson stepped in, followed by two armed guards. She didn't look shocked. She looked bored. "Is it?" she asked, holding up a tablet. "Because according to the digital record, Dr. David Miller just signed the final authorization for the harvest. Your electronic signature is all over the file, David, along with a recorded confession of your mental break that our AI synthesized from your previous performance reviews." David stared at her. "You forged my signature?" "We didn't forge it," Sarah said, her voice like a silk noose. "We optimized the paperwork. You're the fall guy, David. If anything goes wrong with the senator, it's on your head. If the boy dies, it's your signature that killed him." The guards moved forward, their boots heavy on the linoleum. They grabbed David, pulling him off Sterling. They stripped the thumb drive and the stimulus kit from his pockets, tossing them to Sarah. "Take him to the security wing," Sterling said, pushing himself up and smoothing his hair. He looked at David with a cold, triumphant smile. "The surgery starts in 10 minutes. Make sure he has a front row seat to the end of his career." David was dragged down the hall, his feet scraping the floor. He was shoved into a windowless holding cell, a seamless box of reinforced plastic. The door clicked shut with a sound of finality. He sat on the floor, the hum of the high-voltage door frame vibrating in his ears. He looked at his hands. They were empty. No stone, no drive, no hope. He could hear the overhead announcement, the voice of the hospital's automated system. "Surgical Team 2 or 3. Harvest commencing in T-5 minutes." David closed his eyes. He thought of his brother, the silence of the house, the feeling of a heart that wouldn't start. Click, 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 click. He didn't have the stone, but he had the rhythm. He stood up and looked at the wall. Behind the plastic paneling was the pneumatic tube system, the old way the hospital moved blood samples. It was a relic, but it was connected to the main air supply. He found the emergency bypass tool, a small, recessed lever meant for maintenance. He pulled it. The system didn't just open, it exhaled. A cloud of halon gas, the heavy, oxygen-depleting fire suppressant, began to flood the security wing. The guards outside began to cough, their hands clawing at their throats. The door's magnetic lock, sensing a fire emergency, clicked open. David burst out, holding his breath. He ran through the fog, his eyes stinging. He didn't go for the exit. He ran for the observation deck. He burst into the room overlooking OR3. Below, Dr. Marcus Thorne was standing over Leo. The boy was prepped, his chest painted with yellow iodine. The first incision was seconds away. David lunged for the educational broadcast console. It was the system used to show surgeries to medical students. He bypassed the security blocks. They hadn't revoked his educator status yet. He didn't broadcast his face. He broadcast the raw data feed from Leo's bed, the one he had secretly linked to his own cloud storage before they caught him. But he added one thing. He used the console's overlay tool to strip away the mask Sterling had built. Suddenly, every screen in the hospital, from the waiting room to the cafeteria to the OR itself, erupted with a jagged, screaming line of green light. It wasn't the flat line of a dead man. It was the frantic, beautiful mountain range of a brain that was very much alive. In the OR below, Dr. Thorne froze. He looked up at the wall-mounted monitor, his scalpel hovering inches from Leo's skin. "What is that?" Thorne's voice echoed through the intercom. That's a conscious response. The patient is dreaming. Continue the procedure, Marcus." Sterling's voice barked over the speakers. Thorne stepped back, his hands raised. "I'm not a butcher, Robert. Look at the delta waves. He's in there." The room fell into a stunned silence. David watched from the glass, his breath fogging the pain. Subverted. Phase 1. Smart decision. The victory felt complete. David had exposed the truth in the most public way possible. He watched as the hospital board members, alerted by the broadcast, swarmed into the hallway, followed by a pair of city police officers who had been called for David, but now found themselves staring at a crime in progress. David felt a surge of righteous triumph. He had used the hospital's own technology to dismantle the lie. He had saved Leo, and in doing so, he had provided the evidence needed to lock Sterling away for life. This was the logical conclusion to his struggle. The truth had set everyone free. He imagined the headlines, the reform, the purging of the corruption. He had done the smart thing by broadcasting to the entire facility. There was no way for Sterling to hide now. Phase 2. False positive. The reaction was immediate. Sterling was intercepted by the police right outside the OR, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Sarah Johnson was cornered in the administrative wing, her tablet seized as evidence. The board president, a stern woman in a Navy suit, approached David on the observation deck and shook his hand. "You've done a brave thing, Dr. Miller," she said. "We had no idea. We will make this right." David felt a weight lift off his soul that had been there since he was 10 years old. The house wouldn't be silent tonight. Leo was being wheeled back to the ICU, not for harvest, but for recovery. The system had worked, the bad actors were caught, and the hero was vindicated. Phase 3. The crack. But as David walked toward the exit a few hours later, he noticed the lights in the lobby weren't just being dimmed for the night. They were being shut off. Men in dark suits, not hospital security but federal agents, were taping closed signs to the glass doors. He saw a nurse crying by the fountain, clutching a box of her personal belongings. He stopped the board president. "What's happening? Why are people leaving?" She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw not gratitude, but a cold, hard resentment. "The truth is expensive, David," she said, her voice trembling. Phase 4. Catastrophic reveal. The exposure of the corruption wasn't a surgical strike. It was a nuclear explosion. By broadcasting the evidence of systemic, AI-driven fraud and attempted murder to the entire public network, David hadn't just taken down Sterling. He had triggered a total institutional collapse clause in the hospital's insurance and federal funding agreements. The hospital's malpractice insurance was revoked instantly. The federal government froze all grants. The board, facing 10,000 potential lawsuits from every patient treated in the last decade, filed for immediate, liquidating bankruptcy. "We're closing the doors, David," the woman said, gesturing to the darkened hallways. "Not just this wing, the whole hospital, effective immediately." David looked around in horror. St. Jude's was the only Level 1 trauma center within 60 miles. It served the most impoverished neighborhoods in the city. "You can't do that," David whispered. "The ER, the oncology ward, where will the patients go?" "To the suburbs," she replied bitterly. "If they have cars. If they don't, I suppose they'll just have to rely on the truth to heal them. You saved one boy, David, but you just killed the only healthcare option for 300,000 people. I hope his heart was worth it." David stood in the darkening lobby as the heavy chains were wrapped around the front doors. He had won the battle, but the collateral damage was a graveyard. He had been so focused on saving the one that he hadn't seen the cliff he was pushing the entire community over. He walked out into the cool night air, the sound of the locks clicking shut behind him, echoing like a funeral bell. He found Leo's parents waiting by their car. They hugged him, weeping with joy, telling him he was a saint, a miracle worker. David held them, his eyes fixed on the dark, silent windows of the hospital. He felt the river stone in his pocket. Click, 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 click. He had saved Leo. He had lost his career, and he had left a city in the dark. As the ambulance sirens faded in the distance, carrying patients to far-off facilities they couldn't afford, David realized that sometimes the cost of a single life is everything else. He turned and walked away from the silent house of medicine, a man who had finally beaten death, only to realize that death always finds a way to balance the books.